Section 1. Hey guys, tonight we're climbing into the frost-dusted Himalayas, where the air is so thin your lungs protest with every step. You're not here for the view, though, you're here for the butter. Specifically, the thick, salty, slightly funky butter tea that Tibetan monks have been sipping for centuries to stay warm, stay awake, and eventually, drift into the deepest sleep of their lives. Picture this. It's 4 a.m. in a monastery so high up that clouds pool in the courtyard like spilled milk. A monk, let's call him Tenzin, yawns so wide his jaw cracks, then reaches for a wooden churn taller than your ego after one compliment. Inside? A molten swirl of jet black tea, yak butter, and a pinch of salt that'll make your electrolytes sing. This isn't a drink. It's a survival strategy. And you? Well, you probably wouldn't last a day up here without it. Hypothermia would nibble your fingers off by noon, and altitude sickness would have you seeing double by dinner. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story starts with a simple problem: cold. Not I forgot my sweater. Cold, but your breath freezes to your face. Cold. The Himalayas don't care about your modern heating systems. They don't care about your Wi-Fi. They certainly don't care if you're shivering in a threadbare robe at 15,000 feet. What they do care about, apparently, is butter. Lots of butter. Historians still argue whether butter tea was invented by desperate monks or clever nomads, but here's what we know. By the 7th century, someone looked at a yak, a creature that resembles a grumpy, overgrown mop, and thought, "Yes, that's the dairy animal of my dreams." And thus, the foundation for the world's most peculiar bedtime beverage was laid. Fun fact? The earliest versions might have included crushed barley, making it less tea and more hot butter soup. Try falling asleep after that. Actually, you'd have no choice. Section 2. The yaks are not amused. You can tell by the way they side-eye you while chewing their cud with the judgmental air of a librarian watching you fold a page corner. Milking them is less a chore and more a diplomatic negotiation. One wrong move, and that tail flicks like a whip, spraying mud and dignity everywhere. But here's the thing: yak milk is the secret gold of the Himalayas. Richer than cow's milk, packed with enough fat to make a nutritionist gasp, and just funky enough to remind you this isn't some supermarket latte. The monks need every drop. A single yak might only give a few cups a day, but when you're living where trees fear to grow, calories aren't just food, they're fuel for survival, meditation, and those long nights debating whether the universe is more like a butter churn or a teapot. Scholars remain divided. The milking ritual is a study in patience. First you hum. Not a tune, just a low, steady vibration that says, "I come in peace, O shaggy one." Then, you offer a handful of salt, the yak equivalent of a bribe. Finally, with fingers warmed over a dung fire, yes, really, you get to work. The milk hits the pail with a sound like fat raindrops, each one precious. Historians still argue whether the monks or the nomadic herders perfected this dance first, but here's a quirky tidbit. Some ancient texts suggest yaks were milked from the left side only, as the right was considered spiritually impure. Try explaining that to a hungry toddler at breakfast. Meanwhile, back in the monastery's kitchen, that milk is about to undergo a transformation so radical it'd make a butterfly blush. But that's a story for the next section, assuming you haven't already dozed off to the mental image of grumpy yaks and their salty bribes. Sweet dreams. Section 3. The first thing you notice about the salt caravans is the sound. Hundreds of wooden bells clonking against yak hides in a slow, hypnotic rhythm that could lull a snow leopard to sleep. Each yak carries 2 bricks of fermented tea, strapped tight like precious cargo, because it is. One misstep on these narrow cliffside paths, and your entire livelihood tumbles into the abyss. No pressure. You're walking the Zambu, the tea horse road, that snakes through the Himalayas like a drunken scribble. Traders have been making this journey since the Tang dynasty, braving blizzards, bandits, and the occasional disgruntled Yeti rumor. Why? Because down in the Sichuan valleys tea grows like weeds. Up here in Tibet, it's worth its weight in. Well, yaks? The monks need it. The nomads crave it. And you? You're just trying not to vomit from altitude sickness while pretending to enjoy the view. Here's the mainstream fact. These tea bricks were so valuable they became currency. Pay your taxes in tea. Buy a wife in tea. Historians found records of monks using tea bricks to bribe local demons, receipts included. But the quirky bit? Some tea bricks were pressed with elaborate designs, dragons, Buddhas, even the occasional rude gesture, making them the world's first memeable currency. Scholars still argue whether the tea's fermentation process was discovered by accident, a wet sack forgotten in a monsoon, or divine intervention, a meditating monk's Eureka! Moment. Either way, by the time that brick reaches the monastery, it's been aged like fine wine, if wine tasted like a forest floor and could survive a yak's sneeze. The real magic happens when monks shave slivers off the brick into boiling water, releasing an aroma that's equal parts earthy, smoky, and did something just die in this pot? It's the smell of centuries of tradition, and the promise that soon, very soon, you'll be drifting off to the sound of butter being churned into oblivion. Section 44 AM. The monastery bells haven't even rung yet, but the kitchen is already alive with the sound of monks sleepwalking through their first butter tea of the day. You'd think they'd be grumpy. No sane person wants to churn butter before sunrise. But there's a rhythm to this madness. The fire's crackling, the tea's boiling, and the giant wooden churn stands ready like a sleepy sentinel. Here's how it works. First, they boil the tea twice. Not for flavor, but because at this altitude, water boils at temperatures that would make a microbiologist weep. Then comes the butter, great golden slabs of yak butter that plop into the pot with a sound like a contented sigh. Now the real work begins. The monks take turns plunging the churn's wooden staff up and down, their sleeves flapping like exhausted bird wings. It's not just mixing, it's alchemy. The tea transforms from murky brown to a creamy beige, like the Himalayas at dawn. Historians still argue whether the churning motion was inspired by prayer wheels or just some medieval monk's caffeine-deprived delirium. But here's the quirky bit. Some monasteries believe the sound of churning, that rhythmic glug glug glug, could scare away demons. Try explaining that to your downstairs neighbors. And the taste? Imagine if a salted caramel latte and a campfire had a baby, then fed it nothing but yak milk for a year. The first sip hits you like a warm brick. The second sip makes your eyelids heavy. By the third, you're pretty sure you could meditate through a blizzard, or at least nap through one. Fun fact, the foam on top is called tea flowers, and catching the perfect amount on your ladle is a point of pride. Miss by a millimeter, and oh, the shame. The monks might not say anything, but you'll feel it. You'll always feel it. Section 5. The first rule of Butter Tea Club? You don't just drink it. You perform a tiny ceremony with every sip, right hand cradling the bowl, left hand poised beneath it like you're about to catch your own dignity. There's a rhythm to this. Inhale the steam, earth and salt and something faintly animal. Let it coat your tongue. Swallow just slowly enough to feel the warmth slide down your throat. Then, this is crucial, pause. Let the aftertaste linger like a half-remembered dream. Monks didn't invent this ritual to be fancy. They did it because at 15,000 feet, every calorie counts, and gulping your tea is like throwing gold coins into the wind. But somewhere along the way, they realized something peculiar. Drinking this way turns tea into meditation. Your mind settles. Your breathing syncs with the monk next to you. Even the yak butter seems to whisper, slow down, you over-caffeinated maniac. Here's the mainstream fact. Tibetan tea ceremonies are one of the few places where nobility and servants use the same bowls, a radical notion in most ancient cultures. The quirky bit? Some bowls were deliberately chipped on the rims so drinkers would remember to not get too attached to earthly things. Try selling that concept at Starbucks. Historians still argue whether the pauses between sips were meant for prayer or just to stop people from burning their tongues off. Either way, the effect is the same. By the third bowl, time stretches like taffy. The fire's crackle becomes your heartbeat. That one monk in the corner snoring softly? Suddenly the most profound sound you've ever heard. And if you think this sounds suspiciously like modern mindfulness techniques, well, let's just say the Himalayas were doing present moment awareness centuries before it was a hashtag. They just added butter. Smart. Section 6. Somewhere around the 5th cup, you notice it, the drowsiness. Not the groggy, head nodding kind, but a warm heaviness seeping into your limbs like liquid sunlight. Your eyelids develop their own gravity. The monk across from you starts reciting scripture, but the syllables stretch and blur like taffy. Congratulations, you've just been ambushed by butter tea's secret superpower. Turns out, slamming 800 calories of fat and caffeine isn't the energy boost you'd expect. It's the opposite, a biological paradox that scientists are still untangling. The mainstream theory? All that yak butter triggers a slow-release digestion process, like time-lapsing a sugar crash over hours. The quirky version? Medieval monks swear the drowsiness comes from sleep demons, trapped in the butter. Their solution: drink more tea to drown them. Historians still argue whether this effect was accidental or engineered by some sleep-deprived 12th century abbot. But here's the fun part: butter tea naps have their own taxonomy. There's the sunbeam snooze, head lolling against a warm kitchen wall, the scripture slump, face planted politely in sacred texts, and the infamous full lotus flop, which is exactly what it sounds like, plus snoring. The real magic happens when the entire monastery succumbs post-lunch. 50 grown men in maroon robes, snoring in unison like a very holy wind section. Visitors often panic. Is this a mass poisoning? Until some kind soul explains, no, they're just digesting. Come back at sunset when the butter wears off and the debates about reincarnation get loud. Pro tip: trying this at home? Add a pinch of salt to your tea. Not for flavor, because nothing ruins a spiritual nap faster than leg cramps. Section 7. The Emperor's taster gags so violently he knocks over a ceremonial gong. The assembled courtiers freeze, partly from horror, mostly to avoid laughing. Because let's be honest, watching a refined Beijing bureaucrat choke down his first sip of butter tea is the closest thing 18th century Tibet had to viral entertainment. Turns out, not everyone appreciated the Himalayas' favorite brew. When Qing dynasty officials first encountered butter tea, their reports read like culinary horror stories. A rancid concoction resembling liquid tallow, the aftertaste lingers like a guilty conscience. One particularly dramatic envoy claimed it violated the natural order. This from a culture that eats century eggs. By 1792, Emperor Qianlong was so annoyed by the complaints that he banned butter tea at court, a decree about as effective as banning fog in London. Here's the mainstream fact: the ban backfired spectacularly. Tibetan nobles started sending casks of butter tea as gifts to Beijing, knowing full well the court couldn't refuse without causing diplomatic incidents. The quirky bit? Some clever monks rebranded it as medicinal broth and sold it to Chinese physicians, who prescribed it for, wait for it, insomnia. The cure worked, if only because patients passed out from shock. Historians still argue whether the tea feud was really about taste or a proxy war over Tibetan autonomy. But the best evidence comes from a smuggled letter where one monk scribbled in the margin: "If they think our tea is offensive, they should smell their own fermented bean paste." Meanwhile, back in the mountains, the monks kept drinking and napping, and occasionally giggling at the thought of emperors getting outmaneuvered by dairy products. Section 8. The secret ingredient isn't in any recipe. You won't find it listed in monastery ledgers or carved into ancient tea bricks. But every butter tea connoisseur knows it's there, that faint herbal whisper at the edge of your palate, like a ghost who moonlights as a spice merchant. Some say it's a type of wild rhododendron. Others swear it's a pinch of fermented juniper. The most stubborn monks insist it's just mountain air, solidified. What we do know: a few remote Himalayan villages still add a dried leaf they call dremo to their tea, a plant that grows only above 14,000 feet and looks suspiciously like something your cat would cough up. When botanists tried to identify it, the samples kept disappearing from labs. Coincidence? Or are the mountains guarding their secrets? Historians still argue whether this mystery herb was originally added for flavor, spiritual potency, or because some medieval monk tripped and accidentally dumped his medicinal satchel into a teapot. The mainstream theory suggests it might be a natural adaptogen, helping the body cope with altitude. The quirky version? Local legends claim Dremo contains dream spores that tether your soul to your body during sleep. Try getting that FDA approved. Here's the fun part. Modern caffeine addicts have tried replicating butter tea's effects with Himalayan salt lamps and organic yak butter from Whole Foods. They always fail. Because what's missing isn't just an ingredient, it's the centuries of prayer flags fluttering overhead, the iron tang of high-altitude wind, and the unshakable conviction that somewhere, a grumpy yak is judging your life choices. Pro tip: if your homemade version tastes off, you're probably missing the most crucial component: desperation. Section 9. The Monastery Ledger from 1437 records an unusual crime. Stolen: 1 clay pot of winter tea reserves, 2 butter bricks, and the abbot's favorite whisk. The thief? A novice monk named Lao Sang, who later confessed he'd been overcome by tea madness during his first winter retreat. His punishment? Churn butter for a year, which, given the circumstances, was like sentencing a wine thief to work in a vineyard. Turns out, butter tea heists were the Himalayan equivalent of robbing a bank. With survival literally depending on those calorie-drenched cups, monasteries guarded their supplies like dragons hoarding gold. Some installed ironclad tea cellars. Others employed tea guardians, elderly monks whose sole job was to sit by the stores and glare at anyone who lingered too long near the butter. The most effective deterrent? Chronic halitosis. Here's the mainstream fact. Stolen tea ingredients were often traded illegally for chang, Tibetan barley beer, creating a black market that would make a Prohibition-era gangster proud. The quirky bit? Some thieves got creative. One 17th-century bandit disguised himself as a nun and smuggled butter bricks under his robes. He was caught only when summer heat turned his costume into a wearable fondue. Historians still argue whether these crimes were acts of desperation or early caffeine addiction. But the best insight comes from Lobsang's prison poem. The butter was sweet, the nights were long, and my willpower was no match for a blizzard. Meanwhile, modern Himalayan cafes still post signs. Please do not pocket the butter knives. Some lessons take centuries to sink in. Section 10. The manuscript is so old the parchment crumbles at the edges like burnt toast. You squint at the faded ink, classical Tibetan script looping like yak tracks in snow, and there it is. Butter tea is the bridge between wakefulness and dreams. Drink deeply and cross over. The author? A 10th century monk named Dharmasiddhi, who apparently wrote this between complaints about his arthritis and a doodle of what looks like a yak wearing a crown. These frozen archives are full of butter tea propaganda. There's a medical text claiming it cures the 5 types of spiritual fatigue, including laziness induced by demonic hedgehogs. A travelogue from a Chinese pilgrim grumbles that the tea smells like a wet sheep but warms the organs better than fire. Even the Kangyur, Tibetan Buddhism's sacred texts, mentions monks using butter tea to stay alert during all-night debates about, well, how many angels can fit on a pinhead if the pin is metaphorical. Historians still argue whether these writings describe actual spiritual practices or just centuries of caffeine-induced creativity. But here's the quirky bit. Some manuscripts include tea stains of honor, deliberate drips left by monks to prove they'd read the texts while drinking. The medieval equivalent of a read while sipping coffee Instagram story. The real gem? A marginal note in a 14th century astrology text. If the butter separates during tea churning, check if Mercury is in retrograde. Some truths are timeless. Section 11. The British officer's mustache quivers in horror. He's just taken his first sip of ceremonial butter tea at a 1904 trade negotiation, and every Victorian sensibility he possesses is currently staging a mutiny. His diary entry that night reads, "The Tibetans call this tea a libel upon that noble beverage. More akin to greasy dishwater, if one's cook were a yak." Colonial encounters with butter tea were not graceful. British expeditions packed crates of Earl Grey as civilizational armor, only to find Tibetans politely repurposing the leaves into butter tea, a culinary war crime, by Westminster standards. The real tragedy? They missed the point entirely. That oily film Europeans recoiled from? Pure calorie gold at altitude. The saltiness they called barbaric? Essential electrolyte replacement when you're sweating through sheepskin robes. Here's the mainstream fact. British meddling disrupted ancient tea trade routes, accidentally creating a black market where one brick of Sichuan tea could buy a herd of goats. The quirky bit? Some officers tried, and proving butter tea was sugar, resulting in a concoction so vile even yaks refused it. Modern Himalayan cafes still joke about English-style tea being their only failed export. Historians still argue whether cultural disdain or altitude sickness fueled these complaints. But the best evidence comes from a Tibetan merchant's ledger noting, asterisk, sold the hairy foreigners extra rancid butter. They called it authentic. Profit margin 300%. Asterisk. Meanwhile, back in London, the Royal Geographic Society declared butter tea an affront to Christian digestion. Little did they know, their beloved afternoon tea was about to be revolutionized by. Well, that's a story for the next section. If you're still awake. Section 12. The lab results read like a love letter from your cardiologist's nightmares. 1027 calories per serving. Saturated fat content, yes. But here's the twist. That same report notes cortisol levels dropping faster than British colonial dignity in Tibet. Turns out, modern science is just catching up to what Himalayan monks knew for centuries. Butter tea isn't just food, it's biohacking. Researchers found the combo of caffeine and animal fat creates a sustained energy release, like time-releasing caffeine pills made by yaks. The high salt content prevents altitude-induced dehydration better than Gatorade, and with 100% fewer neon dyes. That infamous tea drowsiness? It's your pancreas throwing a parade after encountering actual nutrition instead of pumpkin spice syrup. Here's the mainstream fact. NASA briefly studied butter tea for astronaut nutrition in the 1960s before someone realized serving hot yak butter might trigger a mutiny. The quirky bit? A 2018 sleep study found butter tea drinkers reached REM sleep 12 minutes faster, though participants reported dreaming, unusually vivid, dreams about yaks judging their life choices. Historians still argue whether these effects are biochemical or psychosomatic. But the best evidence comes from a Tibetan medical text that basically said, drink this, stop whining about the cold, and maybe you'll finally achieve enlightenment, or at least stop being hangry. Meanwhile, Silicon Valley types are now paying $25 for artisanal butter tea lattes, blissfully unaware that the original version was invented by people who wiped their hands on sheep. Some things can't be gentrified. Section 13. The nomad's butter lantern flickers, not from wind, but from the sheer improbability of its existence. You're staring at history's most pragmatic candle, a lump of yak butter with a wick stuck in it, melting slowly into both light and breakfast. This isn't just multitasking, it's survival minimalism at its finest. Why carry separate items for lighting and eating when one greasy block can do both? High-altitude living breeds these kinds of innovations. Butter isn't just food here, it's insulation for wounds, barter currency, and in emergencies, makeshift axle grease for prayer wheels. The really clever herders would shape surplus butter into dice for nighttime gambling games. Archaeologists found a 12th century butter die still bearing tooth marks. Some nomad really took the house always wins. Literally. Here's the mainstream fact. Butter lamps appear in Tibetan texts as early as the 8th century, often listed alongside tea as essentials for dark nights. The quirky bit? Some monks believed the flickering of butter flames could reveal future weather patterns, if you stared long enough through a haze of burnt dairy fumes. Historians still argue whether butter's dual use was born of scarcity or spiritual pragmatism. But the best insight comes from a faded herder's song. The butter melts, the light dies, but the stomach stays full. This is the circle of life. Meanwhile, modern hikers still mimic this trick with energy bars and birthday candles. The more things change. Section 14. The recipe is written in code. Not metaphorically, actual cipher symbols scratched onto a palm-sized birch bark scroll, hidden for centuries inside a statue of the medicine Buddha. When scholars finally decoded it in 2012, they found instructions for the Dalai Lama's midnight tea, a butter tea variant containing trace amounts of gold leaf, crushed pearls, and something ominously listed as moonlight harvested during Scorpio season. This wasn't just royal extravagance. These forbidden recipes were the Himalayan equivalent of astronaut food, precision engineered to sustain leaders during marathon meditation sessions. The gold? An ancient immune booster. The pearls? Calcium for bone density at altitude. The moonlight? Probably some poor monk's job description. Third assistant to the lunar tea harvester. Here's the mainstream fact: elite tea blends were considered state secrets, with master brewers sworn to silence under threat of. Well, let's just say yak butter isn't the only thing that disappears in those mountains. The quirky bit? One 17th century text claims certain teas could make drinkers temporarily invisible, a handy feature during political unrest, if true. Historians still argue whether these recipes actually worked or were elaborate placebo rituals. But the best evidence comes from a regent's diary noting, "After 3 cups of the midnight blend, I either achieved enlightenment or hallucinated a very convincing Buddha. Either way, taxes got collected." Modern attempts to recreate these teas invariably fail. Some ingredients are lost. Others, like that alleged sliver of Yeti bone, might be better left that way. Section 15. The tea caves smell like centuries of damp stone and forgotten herbs. Your footsteps echo off walls stained with butter smoke, each alcove holding the ghosts of 1,000 teapots. This is where Himalayan tea culture goes to retire, where monks once stored their precious bricks like bibliophiles hoarding first editions, where travelers took shelter with nothing but a pocket full of leaves and a prayer. Now it's just you and the quiet. The yaks are distant specks on the mountainside. The churning sounds have faded. Even the butter lanterns, those stubborn little stars of grease and flame, have burned down to nothing. It's okay. You're full in that ancient way, not just of calories, but of slow moments and stolen warmth. Your breath sinks with the wind through cave mouths. Your thoughts unspool like steam from a cooling cup. Historians will keep arguing about measurements and trade routes. Scientists will dissect the fat-to-caffeine ratios. But here, in the dark with the ghosts of tea drinkers past, you finally understand what they were really brewing all those centuries. Not a beverage, but permission, to rest, to be human, to let go just a little while the butter does its work. The last sip is always the sweetest. Or maybe that's just sleep talking. Either way, it's time. Wind down, and just like that, we've followed the butter tea trail to its natural end, not with a bang, but with a contented sigh. The yaks have wandered home. The monks have taken their churns inside. Even the tea stains on those ancient manuscripts have dried into quiet history. Whatever brought you here tonight, curiosity, insomnia, or just the strange allure of Himalayan dairy, I hope you've found something warm to take with you. Maybe it's the image of snoring monks in sunlit courtyards. Maybe it's the absurd grandeur of a drink that fueled empires and baffled emperors. Or maybe it's just the simple truth that sometimes, the best solutions are the oldest ones, something hot, something hearty, and the wisdom to know when to stop thinking and start dreaming. The fires burn low now. The stars over the Himalayas are the same ones shining outside your window. Wherever you are in the world, whatever hour finds you listening, thank you for steeping this little piece of history with me. Now close your eyes. Let the weight of centuries press gently on your eyelids. The butter tea has done its work. The night is yours. End of script. Sweet dreams.